There we go.
Okay. And I'm moving chat out of the way because you guys are too entertaining. Okay. Good morning to everyone for yet another episode of History Matters and So Does Coffee. This is my historian brain. It's the 63rd overall, 60,
68th.
68th episode overall. I mean, really, folks. Uh, I'm proud of us. Very proud of us. This week, we're going to be talking about primary sources, which is a subject that is near and dear to my heart, always. But before I launch into that and why it's near and dear to my heart, and then just offer you some favorite examples, some of which I may have discussed before, but not in this context, at least one of which I have never discussed before. But before I do that, leaving you hanging with suspense, I will turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode, and thank you for being here. Rules of the game are as follows. We encourage you to use chat. We love seeing all the good chat. In fact, it's so good Joanne can't physically watch it while she's talking or else she gets distracted.
I get sucked into the chat.
That just shows how amazing you all are. So we do encourage you to use that. Please try to keep it germane to the conversation and, of course, family friendly. If you do have questions, make sure you use the Q&A section at the bottom or wherever your little toolbar is. We'll find it a lot easier to keep track of questions there. And that way we can make sure I don't miss anything scrolling through chat. Do encourage you to ask questions of any kind, and I hope that you do. I may threaten you later. We'll see. And as always, and right? If you enjoy what we do here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can go to our website, www.ncheteach, and click join or look at any of our free content. We have a lot of free content. Hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll be revising some of that and making it look a little bit newer. And then, of course, you can always follow us at History Ed on Twitter. And then both Joanne and myself, of course, you know, Joanne is also on Twitter, so you can follow us there. And there's a bird perched right outside my window. So Newbie has competition today. With that, I turn it back over to Joanne.
I could have blanked out at that moment, but I think you asked people to ask questions, but did not say put it in Q&A.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Put it in Q&A if I did not. Put it in press the Q&A button, put the questions in there. That way I can.
Family friendly was the other thing. I don't remember. I
did say family friendly. I remember that.
I might not have had enough coffee yet, but at any rate, okay. Thank you, Matt.
All right, enjoy.
Yes, you said all of that. Okay. So, I want to talk about primary sources. I want to talk about, let me fix the view here. Better. Okay. I want to talk about primary sources, well, partly because that's what got me into doing history, was primary sources and the fact that in one way or another, whatever kind of source it is, and because I write about elite people, often it's letters and diary entries and memoranda and things like that, but whatever kind of primary source, census records, records of I don't know what, city, we've used some of them actually on History Matters, city directories and all kinds of things that you can pull things from. What I love about them is understood in the right context. It's some part of the past on paper, right? And in the case of a letter, it's someone sat down with something to say and put it on paper. And particularly in the period that I like to write about, when there aren't typewriters or computers, it's someone who literally sat down and wrote something out, and now you have the product of that in your hands. So to me, even though I think I'm supposed to be jaded as a historian, and like, oh, fair, evidence, who cares about evidence? I've never been and never will be jaded, because it really is a little whisper of the past. And particularly for me, I'm a political historian, but my main interest is political culture. And you can define that a lot of ways. One aspect of it for me is the human dimension of politics, meaning how it's experienced. And I write about that question or that topic for the political elite. So how did the elite experience politics, and also how did the American people receive those politics? So I'm always interested in what things felt like and what they looked like and sounded like and what impressions they gave, and all of the unknown or unwritten assumptions, all kinds of beliefs that often aren't committed to paper, but that are between the lines of primary evidence. And when you really stop to look carefully at primary evidence, sometimes that kind of stuff leaps out, and either you see it in one source or you've read enough sources that you recognize a pattern, and in lots of sources you realize, oh, here's something from the past that they haven't said, Joanne, here's an important political pattern, but that's essentially what emerges. I don't remember if see, now I feel like in my classes, if you teach the same classes for 25 years, at some point you get to the point where you're like, I may have told this story 52 times to you, or maybe just once a year, I don't know. So forgive me. Forgive me all throughout today's episode if you've heard some of this before. But seeing patterns in primary evidence and having them speak to you, to me, one of the most striking examples of that partly resulted in my dissertation in my first book. And that is, I started grad school being like the queen of primary evidence, but really not having read very much in the way of history, like scholarly history. So I had in my mind this, my personal index box of letters and documents from the late 18th century. And when I started off in grad school and I learned, here's what you can do with evidence, and here are the questions to ask, and here's how you can find context and why it matters. So I learned to think like a historian, and I realized that I had seen some patterns in the letters that I knew and that they were important. And the one that sort of leaped out at me and then sort of revealed to me that it was everywhere, and I talk about it very briefly, I think, in the beginning, maybe in the introduction to Affairs of Honor, was a letter from James Monroe to James Madison. And he had been insulted in some way by John Adams, who was president at the time, and the letter is Monroe trying to figure out what he should do in response. And what was fascinating about the letter, and what struck me was, excuse me, he went through a list of possible ways he could respond. So he was like, well, I could write a pamphlet, but I don't know if that's going to do enough to stop this. I could challenge him to a duel, he actually says, but he's an old man and the president, so that's probably not a good idea, which, good thinking, Monroe. But he ticks off a list of ways in which he can defend his name and reputation in this political fight. And I realized that's his mental landscape of possibilities in politics. Like, here are the possible ways he can defend himself. He just told me all of the ways in which he believes as a politician he can defend his name. Wow. And when I stepped back and thought about that and thought about other letters, I realized other people were basically abiding by the same general assumptions. Here are the ways in which we can defend our names. That was an amazing insight, right? That's not something no one ever sat down and said, you know what, historians of the future, here are the ways in which we can defend our names, and you're going to need this in the future. But seeing patterns revealed that led to the structure of my dissertation, that led to the structure of my book. Each weapon or each mode of defense ended up as a chapter. So there's a case in which the pattern just sort of opened a world, even though explicitly it was never said in that document. Patterns can speak to you. And I think along the same lines, and I know I've talked about this a lot before, emotion can really speak to you in primary sources. And I've talked a lot, I know, about emotion as evidence, but also emotion in the way that we respond to politics now, and that we need to think about our emotional responses because some things are said explicitly to get an emotional response, and that we should be alert before we give that response. As a historian, I'm very, very interested in emotion as evidence and in seeing how people respond to things, particularly politicians or the public, and then trying to figure out what that shows about the politics and culture of a time. So part of that, I suppose, all of this is to say, primary evidence offers all of these kinds of insights, and there are all kinds of things buried in primary evidence, no matter how well known it is, that people haven't necessarily discovered yet because they just haven't read it a certain way with a certain combination of other primary sources in their head. There's always stuff to be discovered. And then sometimes there are seemingly trivial things that just capture something unexpected about a moment. And the first thing that I want to read to you is one of those things. I found it when I was researching for my most recent book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to Civil War. And it was from the papers of Anson Burlingame, who was in Congress in the 1850s. And it was from his papers. And it's a letter that he wrote to his 10-year-old son. And as I read it, you'll hear why it really struck me and has stayed with me. I even spoke about it once on when I was doing the Backstory podcast, because it's you don't expect to hear this political issue discussed in this way. So let me offer you a bit of it. So his son is named Edward, and he's about 10 years old. And this is from the middle of the letter. So Burlingame writes, "Grandpa writes me kind letters about you. You should do all you can to repay him for his love for you. I am working hard so as to do something for freedom, underlined, by making a speech if I can get the floor. Freedom, underlined, is good, underlined, and is opposed by slavery, which is bad. Slavery takes little boys like you and Walter and sells them away from their parents. Freedom lets them stay at home and go to school, just as you are doing. There is a great country called Kansas, and the people who love slavery wish to put it there, and the people who love freedom wish to keep it out. I am on one side, and Mr. Kit, who had trouble with Mr. Grow in a big fight, is on the other. The people who love slavery are in earnest, and those who love freedom are in earnest. This makes them try to beat each other by making speeches against each other and by voting against each other. Sometimes men like Mr. Kit get so angry as to forget that they are the representatives of the people and become bad blackguards and strike men who will not do as they wish to have them. Grandpa will tell you all about these things. You must try to govern yourself and educate yourself so that it shall never be said of you, he is a blackguard." And he signs it. There's a little bit more. He talks about, be sure to write to your mother, signed, "With all my love, your affectionate father, Anson Burlingame." Now, there are obvious reasons why that's really striking. This is a father writing to a 10-year-old and trying to explain to him the heart of the anti-slavery versus slavery issue and what he is doing and why it's good and why slavery is bad and why some of the people who are defending slavery are doing it in a bad way. It's such a disarmingly sweet and yet powerful way of a father trying to explain to a kid the politics of the time. It stuck with me. I don't know how many years ago I found this. It could be as much as a decade ago, from 1858. It stuck with me because you don't see that very often, right? I study politics and I see politicians writing to each other and husbands writing to wives and wives writing to husbands. But a father to a kid explaining the battle over slavery, that grounds that discussion in everyday life in a really, to me, striking and powerful kind of way. So that's a great example of something that's, in a sense, you could say I didn't find anything new in that letter. There's no new information there, really. But the fact that he's explaining this and the way he's explaining it, it's rare to get that kind of, deep sort of insight into emotion and feeling from a politician in that much earnest and in that much on the page. So anyway, that's for clear reasons. That's a piece of primary evidence that stands out and that you could use in a book. I did, I think, in my most recent book, or in a classroom to show fathers and children, parents and children grappling with really difficult issues and trying to talk about good and bad and in earnest. Now, there's another kind of document that I love, and this I know for those of you who are new and do not know that every week people play bingo because I reliably say some words every week, and this word is probably on every bingo card. Contingency. Some primary evidence gets at the fact of contingency, which sounds really obvious but isn't. And that's particularly true when you're studying, the founding with all capital letters. by definition, if you're calling it the founding, you've already marched happily down the road of assuming things, right? Assuming it happened, assuming it was the founding of something, assuming that it worked, assuming that there was, America won the revolution, America created a constitution, the constitution worked. There's a lot of assumptions and of courses that people even unknowingly have about the founding that removes the struggle and mistakes and decision-making moments and indecision and the reality of figuring something out for better and worse. That's what was happening in the founding, not some grand parade of men in fancy clothes signing great documents. So what's wonderful when documents capture that. One of them that I've used before, and I'll just quote a letter from it. I know I've cited it before. I use it a lot when I do give public lectures, and I try to emphasize to people the fact that you should have no of courses, or very few at least, when you're talking about the founding. It's a Hamilton memo that he writes in 1787, undated, but probably after the Constitutional Convention, in which he, as a lawyer, sits down and writes what he thinks will happen next after the Constitutional Convention, and he says, well, maybe Washington will be elected president, and he lists all the positive things that will happen if that happens, and then he says, well, on the other hand, I don't know if Washington isn't president, or if any of these other things don't happen, then I don't know, maybe, and then the second half of this memo is that there might be civil war, right? And maybe the states will turn against each other, or people within the states will turn against each other, or the Union will divide up, and monarchies will be created in different portions. And he creates this apocalyptic, Great Britain, people might go back to Great Britain. It's all of this stuff and horrible things that could happen. And the striking thing about the letter is, after describing that sort of apocalyptic, if this doesn't work, it's going to be ugly scene, he says, quote, "This, after all, seems to be the most likely result." So this guy just walked out of the Constitutional Convention not that long ago, was part of that convention, worked on it, had been pushing for a stronger constitution for a very long time. He's one of the loudest and earliest nationalists for a stronger national government of the time. Goes through the convention, leaves, sits down and says, yeah, I don't know if it's going to work. Probably not. Talk about contingency, right? That's a slap in the face, of a wonderful kind of slap in the face, saying, if he didn't assume it was going to work, maybe no one knew it was going to work. Maybe it wasn't a sure bet. And that's particularly important when you think about him as, the founder who was the main author of the Federalist Essays. The Federalist reads like, here's why, of course, the Constitution is the obvious answer, because it's, as I tell my students, a kind of commercial advertisement for the Constitution. This shows you what's happening underneath that commercial advertisement, which is Hamilton saying, I don't know. And I've spoken before, I've given lectures before on, you can go through Hamilton's life and see the various moments in which he comes forward again and again and says, I still don't know. I don't know if this is going to work. He had real doubts about it, because he actually really did think monarchy was a great form of government. Doesn't mean he was a monarchist, but still, great with example of contingency. Another one that I love, and I'll just read a little bit of it for you. I know I've talked about it before. I don't think I've read it per se, but it's a favorite that stays in my mind, which is why if I have talked about it before, that's why. It comes from the diary of William Maclay. I've talked about that more than once, I know, who's a Pennsylvania senator who keeps this wonderful diary. I think he misses, I can't even remember, like 12 days in 3 years or something. I mean, he really has this not only consistent diary, but he writes everything down. He writes down his dreams and the toys he buys for his kids and the things people are snacking on in the Senate. I mean, all of the sorts of things that you really want someone to write down, Maclay does. And sometimes he's so wary about it that he will put his notes in Latin so that if someone looks over his shoulder to see what he's writing, they won't instantly be able to figure it out. So he's thinking very hard about what he's putting down here. But the entry, and there are a lot of entries in it that are amazing. The one that I always love, because again, it gets at a moment that is supremely contingent in many ways, gets at the contingency of the founding, and yet we look at this moment as like the biggest, of course, of all times, and that is George Washington becoming president. And Maclay writes in his diary about Washington's inauguration. When I went back to the diary this morning and looked at it to get ready for this discussion, I realized, and I don't think I'd read it straight through in a long time as a diary, but for at least a week before this entry, he's like, Thursday's coming up, the inauguration, that's going to be the day, Thursday, it's coming up. So he's like waiting for Thursday, and then April 30th, Thursday, he has a diary entry that begins, "This is a great, important day. Goddess of etiquette, assist me while I describe it." He has a wonderful, droll sense of humor, does William Maclay. So I'm going to read just a portion of this. The Senate stood adjourned to half after 11 o'clock, so the Senate's going to open at 11:30. About 10, dressed in my best clothes, and then heads off to the hall, turned into the hall, the crowd already great. The Senate met. The Vice President rose in the most solemn manner. This son of Adam seemed impressed with deeper gravity, yet what shall I think of him? He often, in the midst of his most important airs, I believe when he is at a loss for expressions, and this is often, as he is wrapped up, I suppose, in the contemplation of his own importance. He really doesn't like John Adams. Adams suffered an unmeaning kind of vacant laugh to escape him. This was the case today, and really to me bore the air of ridiculing the farce he was acting. Quote, "Gentlemen, I wish for the direction of the Senate. The President will, I suppose, address the Congress. How shall I behave? How shall we receive it? Shall it be standing or sitting? So the President's going to come in. Now what?" He's going to come in to take the inauguration. Do we stand? Do we sit? What do I do? I don't know. Here followed a considerable deal of talk from him, which I could make nothing of. Mr. Lee began with the House of Commons, as is usual with him, then the House of Lords, then the King, and then back again. The result of his information was that the Lords sat and the Commons stood on the delivery of the King's speech. Mr. Izard got up and told how often he had been in the Houses of Parliament. He said a great deal of what he had seen there. He made, however, this sagacious discovery, that the Commons stood because they had no seats to sit on, being arrived at the bar of the House of Lords. So people were like, oh, the Commons is standing and the Lords are sitting during the King's speech. That's significant. And Izard says, well, yeah, because the Commons has no seats because they're in the House of Lords. So much for that precedent. It was discovered after some time that the King sat too and had his robes and crown on. Mr. Adams got up again and said he had been very often indeed at the Parliament on these occasions, but there was always such a crowd and ladies along that for his part he could not say how it was. Mr. Carroll got up to declare that he thought it of no consequence how it was in Great Britain. They were no rule to us, etc., etc., etc. But all at once the secretary, who had been out, whispered to the chair that the clerk from the House of Representatives was at the door with a communication. "Gentlemen of the Senate, how shall he be received?" A silly kind of resolution of the committee on that business had been laid on the table some days ago. The amount of it was that each house should communicate to the other what and how they chose. It concluded, however, something in this way, that everything shall be done with all the propriety that was proper. How shall we communicate between the houses? In whatever way is proper. Excellent. The question was, shall we adopt this bill that we may know how to receive the clerk? They still haven't let the clerk in. Like, the clerk's at the door and they're like, should we go back to that bill we talked about the other day and pass it, even though it doesn't really say anything? It was objected that that bill would throw no light on the subject. It will leave you precisely where you are. Mr. Lee brought the House of Commons before us again. He reprobated the rule, declared that the proper mode was for the sergeant-at-arms with the mace on his shoulder to meet the clerk at the door and receive his communication. We are not, however, provided for this ceremonious way of doing business, says Maclay, having neither mace nor sergeant. And so he goes on in this vein. Finally, Washington comes in, he goes to the front of the room, he gives an address, and I'll close this account with this again because it's touching, because it captures the human dimension of a supremely, seemingly symbolic moment. The president takes the oath of office on a balcony in front of the public. There's cheers. It's sort of a moment. He comes back inside the Senate, and Washington rises and, quote, all arose, and Washington addressed them. This great man was agitated and embarrassed more than ever he was by the leveled cannon or pointed musket. He trembled, and several times could scarce make out to read, though it must be supposed he'd read it before. He put part of the fingers of his left hand into the side of what I think the tailors call the fall of the breeches, which I think is like a modern side pocket, changing the paper into his other hand. After some time, he then did the same with some of the fingers of his other hand. When he came to the words all the world, he made a flourish with his right hand which left rather an ungainly impression. I sincerely, for my part, wished all set ceremony in the hands of the dancing masters, and that this first of men had read off his address in the plainest manner, without ever taking his eyes from the paper, for I felt hurt that he was not first in everything. That's touching for a whole bunch of reasons, but it gets at the reality of that moment, or something of the reality of that moment, and the fact that Washington didn't know what the heck he was doing like everybody else. The fact that, Maclay has so much invested in Washington being a great man who represents the nation, and that he was, as he put it, hurt that Washington clearly doesn't know what he's doing and is embarrassed in front of the Senate and House. Those documents, those kinds of documents, are a reminder of the forward-looking in the momentness of history, that the people who we study in history don't know what's coming. They're looking forward in time in the same way that we now are looking forward in time and really don't know what's to come. And that's a hard thing to capture about the past, but it's vitally important, because if you hope to, in some way, get some part of the mindset of people in the past, if you hope to grab onto that in a way that will let you write contextualized history, you have to try and look that way. You have to put aside the of courses that were nowhere on the scene for the people living in the past. It's part of what I love about history, is climbing into the heads of people as best I can. There's a limit, but still, and trying to figure out the logic of what they're doing. This is why I became so interested in dueling. Talk about something that seems illogical. We shall go out on a field and shoot at each other because I insulted you. There's no logic to that. And yet, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of American, certainly elite folk, fought duels or came near fighting a duel. So there's a great example of something that makes no sense, and yet very smart people, wealthy, very smart people, were doing this a lot. What that tells you is that it was important. It was important enough to them to risk their lives over. And so that kind of evidence is a great example of a practice, a behavior that has a lot invested in it, that looking back from the present isn't apparent, but looking forward in time and trying to put yourself in that moment really can tell you a lot about the political culture of a moment. That's another document or event that started off my thinking about my dissertation. There's a whole chapter on dueling in there, because if you understand why people were challenging each other to duels and fighting duels, you understand a lot about the weird ways in which whatever they called democracy at the time had a lot of aristocracy built into it. Right? It really sheds an interesting light on the founding. Anyway, I can see I'm running out of time and I want to open things up for questions. My overall point here, and I know that there are many people following along who are teachers and already are using wonderful primary documents in the classroom. The wonderful thing about using primary documents in the classroom is it enables you to kind of step down off the soapbox of expertise. And by that I mean, there's a long letter from 1792 that Hamilton writes to Edward Carrington, and I use it a lot when I teach about politics in the 1790s. It's a Hamilton letter. It's like 30 pages long, right? And Hamilton basically says, I shall describe to you the state of politics, the state of national politics. And he writes this long letter, and it's a really interesting and a little bit, I don't want to say wacky, but striking in a lot of ways, and includes a lot of things in it. Madison was my friend first, and Jefferson took him away. A lot of things in it that you wouldn't expect to see. And what's wonderful about that letter is the students read it, and then I say to them, before we talk about anything, what did it make you feel like? What was your impression when you read it? And inevitably someone will say, sounds like high school. Okay, what does that mean? right? And it has something to do with how personal politics is and how personal relationships and friendships matter. And with that kind of primary document, so it's not me holding forth, it's the past speaking to them, and it's us sort of putting ourselves in that moment. That's a really powerful way to teach. And I think primary documents enable you to do that, in a sense, to join the teaching moment with your students and with them sort of say, well, how does this make you feel? What do you think this meant? Why do you think he wrote this? And all of those are questions that, in a sense, there's not a wrong answer, right? What does this make you feel? If someone says something that you don't agree with, well, that's how it made them feel, so that's fine, you know? So I find that's one way among many that primary documents can be a really invaluable teaching tool, because you can plunge into those documents with your students, and then it becomes a really interesting exercise. Okay, I'm going to get off my primary document soapbox. It is impossible for me to state the degree of enthusiasm I have for primary documents, because it's the human dimension of the past that fascinates me, that's so difficult to get a hold of, that's so hard to write about, and that's so rewarding when you find it. I will stop there and open things up for
Well
questions.
said.
Yes. Oh, mug. I know. Mug. Carolee served her purpose. Okay. Carolee is going to be really happy about this. So I ponder. What am I going to use? And here is what I chose. It's the mug that Carolee made me with my tweet on it, because it's a primary document. So I was very pleased with myself that I had my own primary document. Those of you who are not aware of this, this was a tweet. I was walking down the street months. When was this? June of last year. Someone saw me on the street and yelled, "Yay, history!" And I just love the fact that someone recognized me and that was their response. So it is a primary document. Once again, I thank Carolee for making the mug, but that captures a really sort of great thing, not about me, but about the someone on the street responding to learning history in an interesting kind of a way. So that actually would be kind of a cool document for someone to use somehow in the future. Okay. Matt.
Oh, my background. So yes, thank you, Lindsay. And of course, this is an easy one this week. This is the reading room, the main reading room of the Library of Congress. And so,
such a grand place.
It is. I love it. I love the
It's like
picture.
inspiring, and it makes you want to research, and it reminds you of the glory of libraries.
It
And
does. And can I say that the Library of Congress is a terrific partner of National Council for History Education. We love working with them. They've been fantastic to us over the years. And so a little nod to them, but also a little nod to all you teachers out there. If you don't know, the LOC website has just insane amounts of primary sources for you to use. They have a whole teachers page. They have lesson plans. They have worksheets. They can do all of the things. So I highly encourage you to check that out if you haven't already. And of course, if you really want to learn how to use it as a teacher, we do have an online course called TPS Basics, Teaching with Primary Sources Basics, using the Library of Congress materials, which you can find at learning.nche.net. So that's my plug for the day. With that, I'll try one of the many plugs that I have every day. Excuse me. Okay, 7 questions so far. Let's have folks put those in. Let's look at these real quick. Gloria wants to know how you found the Anson Burlingame letter. What was
that's
the
a great
process?
question. That was a case in which I had 3 months at the Library of Congress, actually, and just researching the papers of members of Congress. And Burlingame had a particularly great collection of stuff. It included photographs and a copy of a play about Congress and a bunch of other things. So when I realized that, I was going through the boxes just folder by folder, item by item, and just stumbled across that. So it was, serendipity, the joy of serendipity and researching. So yeah, I didn't know that existed. I stumbled across it and then made happy researcher noises because it's such a great piece of evidence. And you never know what you're going to find when you're digging. You truly never know, even when you're working on things like the Civil War, the Revolution, George Washington. I say this to my students all the time. You never know if you're the person with a particular combination of knowledge and questions that's going to open a piece of evidence in a way that someone hasn't before.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the excitement of doing research.
The letter to the 10-year-old, this is from Dave A. Did that letter spark conversations that were not documented? What do historians know what happened to that 10-year-old boy? Did he go into politics? Did
Oh,
he
that's a
influence
really
people?
interesting question. Yeah, well, well, let me put it this way. I didn't look to see specifically what if there's anything else that I could tell from the letter. I do know that there wasn't a letter from his son in response in the papers I was looking at, or else I would have copied that down. But I right now don't. Anson Burlingame's sons were Edward and Walter, and I can't remember what they both went on to do in life. But that's a great example of you get a little glimpse of something, and then you want to know more, and you can't know more. Sometimes you can figure it out. Sometimes it's worth it to figure it out. But I think about this all the time after I publish a book. Like in my first book, I think I was trying to figure out how long it took a piece of mail to get from one place to another. And the amount of research and looking at horses and timing and the post office and all of this stuff, it took forever for me to figure that out. And in the book, it's like 5 days later, it arrived in Philadelphia. It's like no one will know what it took to figure that out. And this is one of those examples, is that, who knows? If that were my quest, I could probably figure out something more. But, it's you never know how much you're going to be given access to or be able to find access to. I see someone asked about Burlingame. I don't think his papers are digitized, but I don't know, since it's been years since I've been at the Library of Congress. But and that's an interesting thing, is that when I wrote my first book, things basically weren't digitized very often. So I was hopping. Look in the bibliography of my first book, and you'll see how I was hopping archive to get documents. Now there's so much digitized that I fear, and I think it's often true, people don't go beyond the databases. And yet, the vast majority of evidence is at the archives and not digitized. So I try and make that clear to my students too, that just because it's not in the database doesn't mean that it's not important. It means that whoever put together the database didn't have access to it, wasn't interested, didn't find it. It's an interesting downside to having these wonderful databases. Although it's an upside for historians, because if you have the ability, the time and the money to be able to go to an archive and to look at these, papers of less important people, you never know what you're going to find. And you might spend days in an archive, as I have done, pulling through things and finding very little, right? And being like, great, I just spent my research money going to this archive and not finding what I want. But in the process of finding nothing, you see a lot. And those insights, you may not realize it at that moment, but those insights, what you see and what you don't see, end up becoming really crucial. The don't see aspect of historical research is important too, because I remember once doing research, again, at the Library of Congress, research on my first book, and I spent a whole day researching stuff, and then I think I was headed back to Charlottesville, and I was thinking, like, what did I see? Like, I was looking at the election of 1800. I'm like, I saw X, Y, and Z. I didn't see discussion of political issues at all. Like, I didn't see, and then I realized, wait a minute, I was studying an election, and I didn't see discussion of political issues at all, right? That was an important insight into that moment, which I wouldn't have realized unless I had actually paused to say, not only what did I see, what did I not see? Which is also a really good question to ask yourself.
2 comments before we continue. The first is, you all are killing it on the questions this week. Fantastic questions. So Joanne, be prepared, because the next few are really, really good, I think. Okay. But the second thing is, somebody did put an anonymous quote, and just for reference, I generally don't reply to anonymous quotes unless I absolutely have to, and there's nothing else. So keep that in mind it's always helpful to have your name
You matter. Put your name.
Yes, yes. Um, okay. Tim Keen. There's two Tim questions. This first one is from Tim Keen.
Okay.
I think some people, myself included, are intimidated by primary sources due to their complex and outdated language. Is there any advice you can give to help people decipher primary sources?
Which is that's a great question. And I guess I have a couple suggestions. One, I would say whether you're familiar with outdated language or not, and that is if you're reading something and you see a word that's unfamiliar, to not just look it up, but look it up like in the Oxford English Dictionary and see how it was used in the time period you're looking at, right? Because it's very, very often it's used in a totally different sense and you're assuming one thing and then you actually look it up. This happens to me all the time. It happened to me in the last couple months, right? It was actually a Hamilton letter that I had read 1,000,000,000 times, and finally I was like, this is kind of a weird word, and I looked it up and I was like, that's not what I thought it meant. So that's part of the answer is actually taking seriously all the questions you have about what things mean or don't mean. I also think, and this is going to sound goofy, but reading things out loud sometimes is really helpful. And, I think if you acknowledge the fact that even historians have to read things over multiple times before they get it. So, I know the language of the period. I'm good at deciphering handwriting. I'm in it. But even I sometimes have to go back and back and back and read it and read it and read it to finally figure it out. So I totally understand being intimidated by it. I know that, certainly I know that some of my students feel that way when I'm like, here you go, have a box of stuff from the 18th century, go. But I think if you are patient with yourself and realize that I think it's hard for everyone, and that part of well, maybe this says more about me, but part of the fun of primary evidence is figuring it out. And I will say that the history gods virtually guarantee that when you're reading a document, the most important sentence has the worst handwriting. It's like inevitable. And so then you end up like, this looks like an A. Are there other A's in the letter that look like this? Ooh, they don't. Maybe it's an E. Are there other? You end up going letter by letter to figure something out. I don't know why that's always the case, but somehow or other, it's always the case. So I think it's hard for everyone, particularly the further back you go in time. But I think there are all kinds of ways to get around the specifics of language and be able to pull out what's being said. And as alien as some of the 18th century American evidence seems, it's close enough that, like I said, when I use it in my classrooms and students have not read 18th century correspondence before they take my class, they definitely get the oomph, the underlying meaning of the evidence. It's a great question.
Yeah, I just had a conversation with Josh Reed, who's also on the NCHE board earlier this week, and that was one of his comments. Is like, I've read these and they're hard for me. You have to have these strategies or else.
Any of you who are on Twitter, very often a historian will weigh in and say, "Okay, Twitter historians, what the heck does this say?" Right? And all of these historians are like, Samuel Thomas, Samuel Thomas. They'll be weighing in with what they think it says. It's really hard, and sometimes it depends on your knowing the person who's writing. Right? That's the degree to which it's difficult. Like, I can't remember who it was. I don't think it was Horace Greeley. There was a journalist, famous journalist, 19th century journalist, whose letters I was reading at the New York Public Library. And when I first opened the folder, his handwriting looked like just a straight line.
Oh, no.
Right? And I was like, oh, holy crap. I need to know what he said. And to my amazement, the more I stared at like the straight, straight, I began to figure out what it was saying. I wanted someone with a camera to be behind me while I was like, here I am reading the most impossible handwriting and figuring out what he said.
Like, it's in Elvish.
Pretty much. Pretty much.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so the other Tim question here, which is Tim Johnson asks, does long form writing, be it letters or essays, encourage and strengthen abilities to sustain thought or thoughts, plural, giving us something more robust than a tweet or soundbite? Have we lost this skill in our public discourse? And I think what he's getting at here is just this idea of, writing letters and essays as a regular practice. And what is sort of your take on that?
I definitely think every medium has its pluses and minuses, and I do think paper's expensive, ink is expensive in the time period that I tend to write about. If you sit down and you're going to use paper and ink to say something, it's going to have some importance to the person doing the writing, because you're expending time and expense to write it. And yeah, you have the time to explain things in more or less detail. And that's even true in one time period. Like if you read a pamphlet from the 18th century, there will be things that are described or discussed or analyzed in a way that they can't be in shorter form from the same time period. But I also think, every period in time has its own technology and its own forms of communication that are of that moment and that enable certain things to happen and prevent certain things to happen as far as communication goes. And that's part of the trick, I guess, of working with historical evidence, so that at the same time that you can say, yeah, we've lost that kind of long form evidence, so we don't have that kind of insight. On the other hand, we have video footage of things and recordings of voices and, these things. When I was working on my most recent book, and there are photographs of some of the people that I write about, like, it never happened to me before. I worked too far in the past. And so suddenly, just a simple photograph, the power of a photograph, and just looking at a face. So new forms of evidence carry new things that you kind of wish you could apply in older time periods as well. Interesting, Library of Congress, I worked there for a while. I was employed by the Library of Congress for a while, and I remember sitting in on a meeting in the manuscript division, and they were talking about the fact that, and this was a long time ago, with the rise of email, what should they be collecting from congressmen and presidents? What are they collecting? Should they be collecting email? And if they do, in what form? And how do they keep it? And what technology should they use so that it'll be able to be read in the future? And it was the first time, I think, that I had thought about that simple fact, that the library has to think about, particularly in the realm of politics, where is the information and how can they save it? And if they bet on the wrong technology, then whatever they have is going to be, potentially unreadable. So it's technology and research in all kinds of ways is really interesting.
But maybe that leads into this next question by Catherine, which is, can you talk a little bit about the two filters that we get primary sources through? One is what is saved and who saved it. In her work, it's something like 5%. The other, of course, is historians who decide what evidence to utilize.
Yes, that's and a third. Oh, go ahead, finish the question.
No, and which is more significant?
And I'm going to add a third thing in there that I kind of have wanted to talk about and was waiting to see if it would come up in a question, and that's what isn't preserved in evidence at all. So the first two were what historians decide to use versus what is actually there. Were those the first two distinctions?
I'm sorry, what?
What were the,
I was reading the next question.
I know, I could tell. It was what historians acknowledge is there versus what?
Okay, so the first part, so the two filters. One is what is saved and who saved it. Okay. And the other is historians who decide what evidence to utilize.
Right. Okay. Well, they're both really important, right? So what I've been thinking about and wanted to address in some way is the fact that I write about elite white people. And so there's a lot of evidence available, and other kinds of people, there's much less evidence of the kind that I use, like letters and diary entries that either weren't saved or never existed. Archives are selective in 1,000 ways about what's contained in them. They represent what a group of people thought was worth saving. The stuff that they're saving was considered worth or not saving by people before in the past. So there are vast holes and silences in archives. And it's true that when you're writing about things, you're not necessarily thinking about, like I said before, like what did I not see? You're not necessarily thinking about the silences, but the silences can sometimes be more important than the stuff that's on the paper. So I think I think it's important to think about that. I think it becomes important, and you can see this in the work of a lot of historians who focus on, you know, non-white, non-elite people. They're using evidence in amazing creative ways to get at the ground level realities of lives, and it's really hard work. And it really reveals things that often have not been seen before, because you have to be creative and persistent, and you're doing sometimes work that hasn't been done before as far as finding and decoding the evidence. That's huge. That's a huge thing. For historians, you know, part of I use footnotes in part as a way to indicate sometimes if something is distinctive and unique, or if there's a lot that I saw about this. You know, it's funny. My recent book was aimed for scholars and the interested public, and someone reviewed it somewhere. I mean, a normal reader, and I think on Amazon, it said something like a third of the book is footnotes. What is this? Like, what a waste of paper. And you know, I didn't respond, but I'm thinking, yeah, see, everything that I'm saying, much of it is new, and how can I show you that it's new and how to think about it unless I leave the breadcrumb trail in my footnotes? And that's the place where you can say, you know, this is the only example of this I've ever seen, or this was really typical of things from the time period. So I think all of the filters are important, and I think particularly in getting away from just an elite white narrative, it becomes hugely important, and silences and how you can hear what's in that silence becomes hugely important.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple of people asked about this, Dale and Francesca. What is your favorite eureka moment? What is the, like, what is your favorite sort of aha moment you've had in finding a note in the margin, or finding a particular document or anything like that? What is your all-time favorite for you?
I mean, I have a lot of them, so as soon as that question came out, I was like, oh! And some of them are eureka moments because they're sensory, like I could smell something, or, you know, and you don't expect to. I think my biggest aha moment, because it's something really famous and something that you would not assume there's anything new to be said about, was when I was researching the Burr-Hamilton duel at the New York Historical Society. And they normally give you microfilm, or at least 1,000 years ago, they gave you microfilm, and you would read, you know, the contents of there's like a folder that's just duel-related stuff. Mm-hmm. And I had been there before, and I had used the microfilm, and I'd gone through and I'd read everything. The day that I was there on this one occasion, I don't know if they couldn't find the microfilm or whatever, someone actually gave me the box. So first off, this is the box of papers, among which were like documents Hamilton left in case he's killed in the duel. He put them together and they're in the box, right? So some part of me is like, holy crap, like I'm holding this stuff. So that was great. But the aha moment came, I went through the whole box, because ideally that's what you do as a historian, because you never know what you're going to find. And on the bottom of the box was a document, and it was dated 1805, and it was very light handwriting, and 1805, the duel is 1804, so it's unclear what it was. And it's not, you know, Hamilton's packet of stuff. It's just kind of there. And I read it, and I realized it was, so Aaron Burr's second was brought to trial for his participation in the duel. And what I found, William Van Ness, was his notes of the witnesses at his trial. He was sitting in his trial, taking notes of what the witnesses were saying. And that was in the bottom of this box. And what that included was eyewitness testimony of the duel from the boatmen who rowed them across the river to Weehawken, from the doctor who was there on the dueling ground. I found eyewitness testimony of the Burr-Hamilton duel that I could not find any evidence of anyone ever finding before. And I began to research to figure out why that was. What I discovered is on the microfilm, the last thing on the microfilm is that document. It's really light, it's really hard to read, and it says 1805. And I think that probably a lot of people were like, yeah, and just, kept going. And plus, it's not like 1,000 people had been researching the Burr-Hamilton duel. But anyway,
Right.
that was, you
This is
know,
pre-musical.
well, right. But see, that's how I knew that that the 10 Dual Commandments song was based on my book. That actually was this document. There's a line in the song that says the doctor turns his back so he can have deniability. That was in that document. The doctor testifying at the trial is asked, "What did you see?" And he says, "Well, I didn't see anything. I had my back to the dueling crowd." And it was like, oh man, like there were all kinds of things that they did, like the guns are in a sack, and they're like, did you see guns? And everyone's like, oh no, I didn't see guns. I saw a bag. All of these things to kind of get beyond the things that are illegal. So that was what I found in that document, and I had never seen that before. The idea that people turn their back so that they can say, I didn't see anything. And when that line came out in the song, I was sitting with my friend, and I was like, that's my document! That's my document! Which is why I then, when I asked Lin-Manuel Miranda, like, is that based on my book? He's like, yeah, of course. I was like, and that's my document! But that was a wow moment, to the point that, like, I didn't eat, I didn't go to the bathroom, I just sat there with the document for hours, because I knew enough about Hamilton to know that I had never seen that before. So that was mind blowing.
Do you know, have they, because we're out of time, I'm going to ask just a random question. Have they gone through a process of trying to make it more legible since then?
Oh, I don't know, because
there are now that digitization is much better.
I do not know that. I know that, as is the case in a lot of archives, they'll have a collection and a lot of stuff in the collection, and they won't necessarily know every document in it.
Yeah.
So it's totally possible. And I think someone I know, a historian I know, contacted New York Public Library and said, "Where's that eyewitness account of the duel?" And New York Historical Society was like, "What eyewitness account?" Because it wasn't branded that way in their files. So I don't know. There are things being digitized all the time. There are Hamilton papers that are digitized that certainly weren't in the past. So, but in this case, I don't know.
Well, it's 11 o'clock, and just so you know, there are like 6 other questions that are just amazing. So apologies to everybody.
Let me ask a question before we move on. So I hesitated before talking about this today, because normally I have been kind of focused on democracy, and politics, and I thought, well, I know that there's been some interest in talking about being a historian and the historical process, based on the fact that there's lots of questions. Is this something, the kind of thing, should I do this again? Would that be of interest to people in some way or another? Because I'd be happy to do it. I just always kind of assume, I don't know if people are interested. Okay, so
I'm going to go out on a limb, and with all the yeses that are flying through chat right now, I would say yes.
Okay.
We can do a part 2 to this. I think that would be perfectly appropriate.
We can do a part 2. I'll come up with a different way of looking at evidence and being a historian. And okay, for sure. I'm happy. Obviously, I'm so enthused and engaged in dealing with primary evidence and using it to tell history. So okay, I will think about another version of this so that we can keep it going.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah, that's right. It's a way not to wait till the last minute. Evidence part 2, go.
All right. Well, with that, I will let Joanne say goodbye, just on behalf of the National Council for History Education. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Joanne, always for your time and your 68 straight weeks of dedication to this show and to our project here. And thank you for everything that you do. Thank
you, Matt. And to everyone who came, as always, thank you for coming and creating this discourse week after week after week after week. For those of you who are in the mood, we will now switch to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on, so we can be a little freer in the conversation if we choose to be. If you came in through the link, ncheteach.org/conversations, just stay right here and poof, you will be in the after party. If you're watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and enter through ncheteach.org/conversations, and then you will be in the after party too. So join us if we would love to have you. I'm always amazed at the number of people who stick around for like an extra half hour. So please do join us. And if you don't, have a great week, and I will see you guys in a week.
Thanks, everybody.
Saving.